Hello everyone, my name is Neha and you're listening to Dropping Your Armor, where together with Hugh, I have the unique privilege of listening to stories from thinkers, doers, and dreamers, all in the hope of really understanding human beings on a deeper level and from a different perspective, and trying to figure out ways to unlock our potential to shape the world around us. And in today's episode, you'll hear the story of Timm Urschinger. Timm is the co-founder of LiveSciences, which is a company that's questioning how things are done in organizations today and challenging them to create environments that help unleash people's potential. Timm is deeply passionate about bringing Teal principles to the world of work, and together with a few other visionaries, he started the Teal Network to make this alternate vision of organizations more accessible to more people. And if you don't have any idea what I'm talking about with Teal or want to know more about Teal or the Teal Network, you can see the description down below for some links. So I really wanted Timm on this show because, well, I always felt that Timm and I are quite aligned in how we see the world and how we see organizations evolving in the future. But what I was particularly interested in was coming from this perspective of leading in big corporations that have been more traditionally managed. Timm has created his journey in a way that now he serves to create organizations that are truly empowering, purpose-driven, and completely different from the way we imagine organizations to be currently. So I was really interested on how that journey sort of manifested for Timm. And when we started preparing for this conversation, we talked about the topic of control quite a bit. And not just because in the last year that when the pandemic started, I think we've all felt a loss of control to some extent when some of our most basic needs have not been met. And we've found ways, and we are really striving to restore that lost sense of safety within us, but also because the way control manifests in leadership today is also something that probably needs to evolve, since the world around us is just moving at such a fast rate that we can no longer control or hold on to the things that we know. So it was a really insightful conversation with Timm, where we started first with his own story of how this need for control manifested in his life and how it changed through the course of his life. And we also then spoke a little bit about how the inner world of us humans and also the outer world with which we interact, for example, the educational or the economic systems in which we grow up, how they reinforce this need for control, and how we need to actively break free from this and create more leaders and more organizations that are instilling the sense of autonomy and trust, as opposed to this rigid, controlling, and command and control style of leadership. So I really hope you enjoy this conversation as much as I did. Just a heads up, Timm was really enjoying the weather in his garden that morning when we recorded this. So if you hear some birds chirping in the background, that's only because they are in complete agreement with everything that we're talking about. So hi, Timm. I'm so happy we could finally get you on the show. Thank you so much for being a part of this.
Thanks, Nia. Pleasure. Thanks a lot for the invite.
And Timm, I mean, I have a lot of questions for you, and I have been planning, this conversation in my head for a very long time. So I have a lot of things that I want to talk to you about. But before we begin, for the people who are listening, do you want to quickly introduce yourself and tell them about what you do? What's your mission and calling in life?
Sure. So first difference is I have not planned out that conversation in my head yet. So that's probably the first thing. Otherwise, what I can tell the listeners about me is, so I'm a dad of 2 little ones, living happily here in the Black Forest in the middle of nowhere. That's good fun. And I think it also comes back to some of the topics that we'll talk about, right? Which is how do you find your inner grounding to a certain extent, and how does that relate to your work life maybe as well? So from a professional perspective, I'm I have founded a company called LiveSciences together with a few friends some 5 years ago. We set it up according to Teal principles. So for all of the ones who have read or have heard about Frederick Laloux and reinventing organizations, that's what we based our ideas on. So in short, it's a bit more purpose-driven. We take a look into wholeness and how we can provide a more human workplace. And obviously it's self-managed, which also goes up to something like self-defined salaries for everyone in the company. And besides that, I'm really passionate about leadership, organizational development, making work somehow fun, reasonably fun at least, and not frustration led, kind of like if you look at Gallup studies and whatever. So that's the big passion. And with that, how can we change the world that we're living in by changing workplaces, really? So that's the passion, I would say.
Yeah. And I would really vouch for Timm's ability to have fun. That's actually mostly the reason I wanted him on the show, because I knew we were going to have some fun here. So yeah. Thank you for that intro, Timm. And I also want to start with a bit of a tune-in question before we get into the meatier topics that we wanted to talk about. So just something light and fun for us to think about. And it's this. If you had a remote control with only one button that controlled something in your life, what would that be?
In the kind of the dead answer is probably something to control the kids. But then again, I was thinking about that question before a little bit, is like, probably it's to turn on my personal motivation to exercise more in that virtual home office pandemic type of world, because that's actually something that I struggle with a little bit. Is like the kids are going to bed finally some point in time. I've worked for too many hours probably. So how do I find my motivation to exercise? Because I should do that probably a bit more.
You know what? That's actually a really great answer, because it's kind of the opposite of my answer. Because when I was thinking about this, I was like, you know what? I would really like a button that just gives me food whenever I want it, and without me having to move from my couch or make a decision on what I need to cook now. And
yeah, okay.
So
a food
really
button
like
also sounds good.
It's
yeah,
much healthier.
Yeah.
Right? Yeah. Maybe we can combine our remote controls and, get the best of both worlds. What do you think?
I think the worst part would be if I hadn't my remote control for the exercising and I just had the food one, because that would probably be counterproductive for anything that is like no exercise and more food. That's probably not a combination for me, but yeah.
Yeah. I wanted to ask you if you could tell us a little bit about your story, about where you grew up, a little bit about your childhood, and what does control have to do with all of it?
Yeah, good question. I think I haven't talked about this one specifically, so great that you're asking a bit of a different kind of question, actually. So how did I grow up? I actually grew up where I'm living now. So I'm little village in the Black Forest, peaceful, quiet. So there's nothing wrong in that place. The world is just okay here, I think. So that's the kind of childhood that I had for at least, I don't know, the first, I guess, 10 years of my life, 11 years of my life or something. And I think I always had parents who were like, well, do whatever you like to do, as long as you know that there's consequences coming with it. And if you mess it up, well, then it's your accountability. So I learned that quite early on, right? That whole, I guess, self-reliance, but in a peaceful, protected kind of environment. And I think the time when that maybe changed, or when the first kind of moment was where that was maybe looking a bit different, was when I was, I don't know, what was I, 12 years old, I think, when my parents got divorced. And obviously, you live in that peaceful, protected world, and then all of a sudden your parents divorced. That's at least nothing that was working in my head at that point in time, honestly. And obviously I didn't have control about any of these things that were happening. So my dad moving out, these kind of topics. And I think what was good and at the same time challenging was my parents still had that thing of like, well, it should be your decision. So do you want to stay like 50-50, 50% of the time with your dad and with your mom? Do you want to do like weekend visits like most people do? What do you want actually? So that is quite nice. But then again, if you're 12 years old and it's your parents and you don't want to hurt any of those, obviously, right? That's actually quite a tough decision.
Yeah.
And then the other part that was like, this whole with the authorities and about kind of money that my mom might be getting from my dad or not, and how that relates back to my decision, you know, these kind of things. So I think that was the first moment where I was like, well, that's a bit of a different relationship now to being accountable for everything, right? So that's I think one of these moments where kind of perspective changed, I think, in many ways. And yet at the same time, it was in hindsight, I must say, probably it was actually nice to be in control and to do the things that I wanted to do, and I did it differently to my sister, for example, as well. So that was actually a nice experience in that sense. And yet, probably the second moment was like, I mean, I was working for big corporations, I was working for consultancy companies, and most of these companies are not treating adults as adults in these organizations, and it's almost like a parent-child relationship. We're actually not empowered, and we're not like on an eye level, right? And obviously that didn't work at all for me. With all that upbringing, with all that experience, and that exposure to self-accountability in early age already, it's like I'm not going to report into anybody who's micromanaging me. I mean, that's just not what I understand in like being an adult. And coming back to the work fun stuff, that's also not fun for me, right? I want a certain accountability. So that said, I think this whole leadership picture is really, really driven by that whole childhood upbringing story. And obviously, for my first consultancy company that I worked for here in Switzerland, it was a fairly small one. It was growing quickly when I was there. I got a lot of accountability, so I got a lot of exposure. I got a lot of leadership experience there. And it was just something where I thought, well, that feels good, that feels right. And at the same time, we have a governance system like structures and processes and whatever that are completely counterproductive for all of these things that I like. And that was then the path into when we founded LiveSciences. Well, how do we run the company? How do we do that differently? And it was really just by chance that we stumbled over Frederick Laloux's work. But it was definitely something where we were like, okay, we don't want to introduce the same kind of bureaucracy and stupid stuff that we've experienced before, all of us actually.
Yeah. And I can so resonate with that because, it for me, it brings up a lot of things. I think your early experiences really have an impact on you and how you sort of see the world around you. Of course, we know that from research and psychology and all of that, but it's something different when you live through it. And what that brings up in me is, so I grew up in India, which is, and it's a different environment, of course, from Germany, but my parents didn't get divorced, and I didn't have that feeling of, loss of control in that sense. But I had a lot of restrictions growing up in India as a girl, right? Your parents care for your safety. You have a curfew while your brother doesn't. You have to tell them where you go, who you talk to. You're never in control of your own time or your own life. And I can really remember the first time that I moved out and I moved to Germany, and I had this walk around Bamberg, which is the city that I was living in at that time, at 12 o'clock in the night, at midnight. And there was no reason for me to walk around Bamberg at midnight, but it just felt so freeing that, I can do that. I'm doing it because I can. And those moments they're so pivotal. And it also sounds like when I hear your story, right, that moment where you were in an organization where you were treated like an adult and something different, you have all the control, you decide, you have the accountability. It's refreshing in a way, but it's also it's sad that it's refreshing because it should be a basic right, don't you think?
Yeah, true indeed. And I think this is the part where I think many of the systems that we are living in are really structured in a really strange way, right? Because privately we are taking all of these big decisions. You get married, you buy a house, you get kids, you buy a car or something. So that's all big decisions with quite a big impact actually. And then you're coming into a company and you can't decide for 50 euros because you need an approval from your boss or somebody a level or two up for some expenses or whatever, right? So this is I mean, first of all, that's I think completely stupid to design these kind of systems in that way. And the reason for saying that is twofold. One, again, I think it's sad for individuals that they don't have at least that little bit of accountability, and that they have that bit of kind of room to shape certain things. And then obviously from a company, from an organizational perspective, you're just wasting resource, time, money. You're probably losing a lot of innovation, of great ideas, because of people who just say, well, you know what, that's really too cumbersome. I will not go through that process. I will not bring in my ideas, because I know it will have like 5 leadership teams that need to approve it. So I will just not do that. So there, it's I think a lose kind of situation actually, and it's really fascinating. I think that it is indeed refreshing to look at these other examples, because there are other examples out there and pretty successful actually, and still, even though it is lose for I don't know how many decades now, and we know that from science, from studies, from everything, we're still not changing it. So that's the interesting thing, I think.
Yeah, it's still so sticky. And I think it's part of it is, I was reading about it yesterday, that part of it has to do with the fact that there are people who have that very deep sense of fear of losing control. And, you know, there are different schools of thought. There's also Karen Horney's work around moving against, moving towards people, all of that. There's also people who are interested, the leadership circle profile, which talks about reactive tendencies, and controlling one is a very strong one. And that's something you see a lot in leaders who've made it to the top. That's because inherently, I feel like when you're controlling, you have that innate drive and that perfectionism. And in the short term, it gets you to the top, right? You put yourself out there, you're in a leadership position, and then you're sort of still creating that culture from the top. And I just feel like it's a bit of a vicious cycle, right? You have these systems that are designed to create more controlling personalities, because you tie people's self-worth to outcomes that they create from very early on. And at the same time, you know, that the system still pervades, because those are the people who come to the top and then probably stay there if they're not completely, you know, if they cannot imagine a different reality.
And I think it's also important to recognize where that comes from, right? Because if you look at industrial revolution, if you look at, I don't know what, 60s, 70s, where mainly was around the conveyor belt efficiency and all these kind of things. And what happened was that this picture about the perfect leader is that perfect leader who knows everything, who has the answer and the solution to all of the problems that we're having. And to a certain extent that worked, and it brought us, and it brought many of the big companies to where they are today. The thing is, if you look at the world around us, the complexity is increasing, right? And that means you cannot possibly have the answer to everything. You cannot possibly have the solution for everything. So that leadership picture still sticks. We acknowledge that the world is getting more complex. We acknowledge that actually you cannot know everything, right? So there's always the discussion, who's the last person who kind of knew everything that was kind of available regarding knowledge on Earth? Was it Einstein? Was it way earlier? You know, these kind of conversations. But I think one thing that everyone is agreeing is you cannot know everything, full stop. And the question is, how do we change the leadership picture then? Because if you cannot have the answer for everything, then obviously it's also the wrong leadership picture. Kind of this archetype needs to change as well. So and that is something that is incredibly hard, because it's kind of a self-fulfilling prophecy. What brought the leaders to where they are, like kind of whatever, 30, 40, 50 years ago maybe, is not necessarily a good leader today. But then again, we have all learned from these incredibly great leaders, and we've all kind of inherited how they got there. And obviously we've also all have been promoted based on these same principles. So we're kind of getting trained in that system. So once we're moving up that ladder, there is a certain likelihood that we actually obviously adapted to the system. And that said, there's a lot of work that needs to be done for unlearning. And the unfortunate thing about unlearning is it takes a lot of time. It is incredibly difficult and is not straightforward.
Yeah, and someone who fears losing control, I mean, if you're brought up in that system, you have that inherent fear, right? The thought of unlearning, just stripping away everything that you know, to go from a knower where you're the expert and you have control over what you know and what you say, to a learner where you can say, I don't know, and you're open to exploring is hard, right? And it's also hard because, as you said, I think it's not just in the organizations, it's the way we're taught in schools.
Definitely.
you are rewarded for every A you get. If you get 100%, it's great. You get into a good university, all of that, no questions asked. There's no question about the how or how you're learning. It's all about the end result.
And I'm embarking in a little hobby project at the moment where we kind of try to rethink how school, especially early school days, work, kind of giving it a teal touch. But anyway, besides that, I had a really good conversation, I think 2 weeks ago or something, with someone, and we were discussing that fear of missing out, that FOMO, right? And she actually gave me a new term which I haven't heard before, just 2 weeks ago, and it's called JOMO, the joy of missing out. And in the first place, it kind of sounds a bit stupid, right? But if you really start to reflect, and I started to reflect, it's like, it is so good to not be involved in everything that's going on in our company, for example. It is really good that I'm not involved in all the shit going on in the kindergarten or wherever, right? And yes, there is so many things in the world that go completely wrong. But if I would be involved in all of that stuff, I would probably go crazy anyway. So there is this joy of missing out on certain things. And I see that kind of every day in our little Teal self-org setup, where I'm like, there's actually great stuff happening and I'm not involved. And that is just really, really good. And that's the joy of missing out. So, there's this different kind of, I don't know, pattern or terminology maybe that we maybe need as well to change some of these things.
Yeah. And I was laughing because I think we had this conversation 2 weeks ago where I remember telling you, maybe you forgot, Tim, but
it was you, that really smart person.
I don't know.
Here we go.
I was that really smart person who brought this term to your life. Come on, Tim.
Excuse me, Neha. I should have thought about that because obviously the brilliance and wisdom that there was actually obvious that was coming from you, right?
Yeah, absolutely. So yeah, but it brings us back to a full circle. So that's great. I'm happy that I heard the joy of missing out from you. Well, I can't take full credit for it either. I also heard it from some very smart people. So. But no, I am with you. I really think we need those new terminologies. We need that. We need to embrace that joy of missing out. It's the FOMO is getting old, and it's actually making us really tired. What's really interesting is FOMO reminds me, and when I was looking into, research around fear of losing control and also thinking a little bit about it, one of my friends, she sent me a message about how she is suffering from revenge bedtime procrastination. Have you heard of this?
Nope. Actually not.
Nope. No. Okay. It's super interesting. But apparently it basically means that it has to do with when you are working all day and you have very little control in your workday. Say you're working in a very, traditional setup where you have to get approval for every single thing you do. And it's like from morning till evening, you're completely exhausted. You haven't had the joy, right? In your day. You spend your nights, instead of sleeping, even though you're really tired, doom scrolling or staying up on social media and actively seeking revenge on your bedtime so that you could gain some control back into your life. And I found that really interesting. And it made me wonder if when we do, when we move towards, as an organization, towards Teal, or even when we evolve our own leadership and give up some of that control in leading others, does that control show up in other parts of your life, or is it really just gone? And I would love to hear your thoughts on this.
Not an easy one, I think. So I think one of the key things that I've been working on and that I've been trying to reflect on more is, how do you just really live in the moment, right? And that is I think one of the key things. So if I'm working, if I'm doing the podcast here with you, well, then I'm here. If I'm playing with the kids, well, then I shouldn't think about the meeting tomorrow or the workshop in 2 days or something, right? So there's a lot of trust in yourself as well, obviously, that you got things under control, or the trust into, for example, the team that, well, if some of the balls are dropping from time to time because they simply forgot, that's obviously happening, but we will make up for it somehow, right? So there's that trust, that safe space to a certain extent also for these topics. But I think really, a bit of inner work around how do you really let go, how do you really live in the moment is a key thing, and some people will use meditation for it or some kind of other practices, right? That's pretty individual, I think. I'm, for example, not really meditating a lot, and yet that whole thing, how do you stay in the moment, and how do you then kind of resist to control in other spaces as well, is I think really, really important. Just one quick thing, I think, on that whole leadership, letting go of control and kind of story. I think there's also really interesting work from Peter Koenig around the source. So there's always a source, kind of the source for a specific topic. I mean, the source for founding the company is probably one of us 3 founders. And then there is a source for certain things that are happening in the company. And I think this is also interesting to acknowledge is if you let go of that whole control thing, you just provide room for others to being the source and changing something and bringing innovation in and bringing in some great ideas. That if you were always in control, it's always just you who can be the source, and that's obviously limiting.
Okay, interesting. Can you say more about this source theory? I actually haven't heard about it.
Yeah, so I'm definitely not the expert, so I hope Peter's not listening because he could explain it way better. But you can look it up, and I can send you some links maybe as well. But so the basic thing is that, and it's fairly easy to explain with starting a company, right? So there's for us, for example, there's 3 co-founders, and what Peter would say is, look, it is not 3 sources. It's always one source. Somebody started a conversation. Somebody was kind of the spark who ignited the whole journey. And if you talk to founders, and probably also if you talk to the 3 of us, I think we would all say intuitively, without having had that conversation, but I think intuitively we would all say the same thing. It is that one person, and it's, by the way, not me, who was kind of that source for the company. And then there is now, if you look at how the company developed, I mean, there's kind of a different business unit that we are trying out things where it's more into training and these kind of things. And it's pretty clear that there's one source who brought it up, one kind of leader who's shaping that whole space there. And that is pretty interesting to see that Peter says, look, there's also only one source. There's never 2 or 3 or whatever 4 sources. And that is something that is interesting in many of these Teal setups, and also for us, we had many of these conversations is, are we co-leading this effort? Maybe we are, right? Maybe we are sharing the leadership, but there's one source, and that makes a difference in how you look at leadership as well. So I find Peter's work really interesting. Need to dive a bit deeper, and we could probably have another hour of a discussion about the source work and all these kind of things. But yeah, I think it's just an interesting link to leadership and control.
Yeah. No, it's interesting, and while you were talking, for me, the metaphor that came up is of a river, right? You have one source for the river, but when it flows down, it cuts its own path, right? It's not the source still controlling the end of the river, but it just gives it life, and then it sort of cuts down. But that's actually a really interesting way of looking at leadership. Yeah, thank you.
That's a really good metaphor as well. I note that down, and probably I'll tell you in 3 weeks about it and saying that smart person. Somehow I don't remember who, but anyway.
Good. You get 10 points, Tim. We're having you back. Awesome. I'm really enjoying this. I mean, we talked a lot about control and the need to shift our view of leadership and also organizations from a very command and control approach to self-organized Teal practices and principles. But tell me, how did you actually, first of all, make that shift for yourself? And then also, how did you bring that shift? Well, I mean, LiveSciences was founded on those principles, but how do you see that shift happening for organizations?
So first of all, it all starts, I think, with, at least for me, it started 2014, 2015, when I was fairly frustrated with my job back in the days. And with consultancy in general, by the way, right? So I thought consultancy is probably the shittiest job that you can have on earth. And so I was quitting my job in 2015 and thinking, well, what's the stuff that I want to do? And I was like, definitely not consultancy, coaching, and that kind of stuff. I will just open a restaurant and cook and, you know, things that are fun in life. And I was going back and reflecting a bit on, okay, so what kept me doing that job for like 10 years that I actually have been doing? What was the fun part in it? What's the stuff that I really enjoyed about it? Because obviously there must have been some things that I enjoyed, because otherwise I wouldn't have done it for 10 years, most likely. So, and reflecting on exactly these things then brought me to, well, actually, you know, there's a certain way of collaborating with people. There's a certain joy of you create something together. There's a certain joy of also celebrating successes together and you know, just being together in that journey to a certain extent. So really it is about that, well, I guess personal awareness, whatever you call it, inner journey kind of story where I just reflect about what's really important for me, what does really matter in life, and also specifically in that case in professional life, what's the stuff that I like. And I think this is always also for many of the leaders that we work with in bigger organizations, that's usually the starting point where they're figuring out, well, first of all, I don't always want to have the answer. Sometimes because they know that they don't have anyway, but sometimes also just, I mean, there's this famous saying, it's lonely at the top, right? And that is coming from exactly that. I always have the answer and these kind of patterns. So I think many of the transformations, I guess, start with an individual reflecting for themselves about what they really want in life. And then obviously in the second step, there's these other layers that come in. Well, how can I bring that to my team? How can I bring that to my organization? And then you just try to integrate these three layers. And what I've also seen in many of these big transformation programs in multinational companies is, if I have been on that personal journey and the journey of the organization is not going in the same direction, people will leave. Right? I will leave the company if that's not fitting anymore, and that's perfectly fine. So there's this time when, I mean, there's this thing about change it, love it, leave it. So either I love what's happening because it's in line with my values and what I want from life. Easy, okay, fine. That's actually great. Change it. I try to bring in myself into that transformation. That's where most transformations start. Some leadership person brings in his or her like consciousness and just will for change, or you leave it, and that's then obviously this, well, most of the time also the end for many transformation journeys is that leadership team or that one person who's actually just getting frustrated with the rest of the organization.
And how has it been for LiveSciences in that regard? How have you faced any challenges? Has the controls crept up? Because you have great examples of organizations that are on that journey, right? But there are far and few in between. So does it feel lonely sometimes? And do you have the temptation to give in to the command and control at times, especially when, you know, COVID hit and something drastic happens and all you hear from all around is, in crises, you want to have complete control and you go into command and control leadership. Did that ever happen to you?
Funny enough, it didn't happen for the COVID situation, I must say. So there was a fairly smooth transition actually for us, and I think it was not that anybody took back control, but I think there is that balance that you need to strike of autonomy and alignment, and alignment might need a certain level of direction or of controlling type of leadership as well. And I think the moment for me when I had the feeling like, screw that whole self-organization setup actually, is I think in 2019, it was, I don't know, what was it, April, May something, when looking at the cash flow, at the pipeline, I mean, it was not that like where it was like really emergency, but it didn't look great, right? So we had this situation where April, May 2019 just didn't look good from a business perspective. And what was interesting for me was, we spent, I don't know, about 4 or 5 weeks, I guess, at least discussing that situation internally. And we had that one meeting in Basel that I still remember. So back in the day, still face to face, right? So we were sitting around this table and we were discussing, looking at the numbers, at cash flow, at pipeline, at utilization rates, you know, the typical things that you would look at in a consultancy business. And we all looked at the same numbers. And we were sitting there and the question was, what do you think is the likelihood that we need to lay off at least one person to make it work again, right? Because if cash flow is not there, well, then you need to save salary somehow. And the interesting thing was, so I looked at the numbers, I was like, almost zero. So if you ask me to put a percentage bigger than zero, it's probably 1%. Full stop. Not a huge risk, right? It doesn't look great, but then again, it's fairly okay. And the interesting thing was the range was up to 50%. So there was a person sitting at the table saying it's 50-50 that I will lose my job. Look at the very same numbers that I looked at. So we obviously gave that room, right? Because that's a big conversation to have. So I don't know, we spent 4 or 5 weeks discussing that. I must admit, I'm a bit impatient for some things. So I was looking at the numbers like, it's not great, but it's not that bad either. So we will not lay off people, full stop.
Yeah.
Leave me alone with that conversation. So that was the point in time I thought, you know what, if I was just the manager of that team, I would have said, you know what, you guys all shut up. Or probably in the first place, I wouldn't even have shown them the numbers, right? So I just really wanted to move on and didn't have that conversation. So that was the point. And I was like, oh, that was self-org setup, transparency, discussing everything with everyone, really cumbersome. But it was just my personal impatience, and it was really good to have that conversation. And maybe that was the reason also for example, when COVID hit, when it was fairly smooth, because we had built a certain capability, a certain exposure to these conversations. And probably people had a different point of view during COVID times now as well. But yeah, that was really a cumbersome, like 4 or 5 weeks period for me.
Good. So Tim, I know I can talk to you for hours, and we probably will do something and talk more about the joy of missing out and other cool concepts. But just to wrap up this discussion also, like what is the one big challenge that you're working on right now, personal or professional?
So I think one big challenge still is that whole patience story for me personally, right? Because there are situations where I'm like, I feel like I have had that conversation for 10 times, and that's just my impatience kicking in, and probably also my emotions kicking in for certain things. So that's definitely something I'm personally still working on, right? How to get a bit more patient, or maybe also just enough compassion to see there's other points of view, there's other perspectives, and probably other needs as well from people, why we have certain conversations in my personal biased view for like 10 times. And so that's definitely something for me personally. And if the team listens to that, some will laugh and say, well, that's actually the conversation we had. So that's one thing for me personally. From a company perspective, or just generally, I think that thing that you also said from Otti Vogt from the Teal Around the World conference speech, there's how do you really make a difference in the sense of you look at the broad environment that we're living in, from a society, education, how we run businesses, but like everything, right? This humanity, and how can we make a difference there? And I think that there's still that question, like, will it change just because we're working on a few little transformations with a few people here, having whatever 8 billion people on Earth? Is that really making a difference? So how do you really have an impact and change that system, or the systems probably that we are living in right now? So that's the big question that I'm pondering about, also with Otti, by the way, and some of the other folks, is how do we create more impact? How do we make that change happen? So if anybody listening has the magic bullet, I would be interested in having that conversation, obviously.
Awesome. Okay, I promise you, Tim, very last question. Actually, it's a fill in the blank, so it's very simple. Just to tune out, tell us, by completing the sentence, when I drop my armor, ...
I will talk more about my personal emotions and feelings.
Beautiful. Great. Thank you so much, Tim. It was really lovely talking to you. And yeah, I wish you a great afternoon, and I hope we can have more of these conversations together.
Sure. Thanks a lot, Neha. Pleasure, as always. Really enjoyed the conversation and looking forward to the next one.
So I hope you enjoy this conversation. If you want to get in touch with Tim, please also see the description below for his LinkedIn. And if you have any feedback for us, as always, your comments and your feedback is really helpful. So you can always write to us through our email, which you'll also find in the description. Thank you very much.